Take your Bibles and turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 5. Hebrews, chapter 5. Verses 1 through 10. It says this way. It says this. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself was subject to our weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes his honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. It's the word of the Lord today. My cousin's wife, my cousin by marriage, I guess, right? My cousin is a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Greenland, which, if you don't know, Greenland is kind of the end of the world. Very cold end of the world. But he's back in the U.S. for his station now. He's toward the end of his career in the Air Force. And anyway, sweet family. He has small kids actually still. And his wife, wonderful, sweet woman. And she told this story. She was taking an online class. I'm not sure what kind of class it was. It was just one of those courses she wanted to take. And so she was sitting there. It was a Zoom class, so you could see everybody on the screens, and she was on the screen, and they had these long discussions. And there was a couple of hours, and then there was a break. And after a couple of hours, they took the break, and one of her actually, she said more than one of her classmates texted her very quickly during the break, saying, one of them said, "I know this is strange, but, and I'm sure it's nothing, but you're sitting in front of a bookshelf." No, another thing, my cousin collects history books, like military history and stuff. I mean, he's an expert in those areas. And so here's the colonel's wife, right? And she's sitting in front of his bookshelf. And the woman who texted her said, "There's this Nazi symbol right behind you. And it's just really distracting." And I don't mean to be offensive to you, but what is going on with this Nazi symbol behind you? Well, it turns out there was a book behind her. It was a World War II history book called The Rise of the Third Reich, which is just a history of how Hitler came to power. But the publisher, and all the publisher's brilliance, put a little Nazi symbol on the binder of the book because it was about the rise of the Nazis. And now, if you knew my cousin's wife, she's quiet, very gentle, meek, godly, sweet woman. And she said, "I immediately yanked that book off the shelf, and I was so embarrassed that symbol would even be in the background, for me there." And she puts this story on Facebook. And my cousin, the colonel, he goes, "Well, make sure you put it back because they're all in order." And I was like, well, that's real sensitive. I say all that to say, we don't want to be identified with anything that brutal or evil or harsh or negative or just plain old bad. We don't want any connotation that links us with anything that bad, which is a good thing. And that's what my sweet little cousin's wife was, concerned about. Oh man, she said, I couldn't imagine these people just watching me on the screen for 2 hours with this Nazi symbol in the far background right behind me, just this little thing that they could just make out. And she said, I was just so embarrassed that the first thing I did when we came back online, she said, I just told everybody what it was so that I wouldn't be ever linked with anything that bad, that evil. And that story stuck with me this week because as I was preparing this message about God's gentleness from Hebrews 5, which it really talks about, it's Jesus who has come to demonstrate the gentleness of God, the sacrificial love that God has been trying to pour out on us since the beginning. And we kept missing it because we kept identifying God with the wrong thing, with the wrong motives and with the wrong personality and with the wrong characteristics that are not God, but we sort of create God in the image of sometimes things that aren't so good. For instance, psychologists tell us if we had a harsh parent, that we sometimes place God in that kind of vein where God becomes this embodiment of our harsh parent, or a harsh dad or a harsh mom who was abusive or aloof or distant or mean to us or whatever. We associate God with that, and we sort of walk around with this idea of God as being that. Or they tell us we associate God with the bad things that have happened to us. And we've all had bad things happen to us to some degree, some worse than others, certainly. But we walk around thinking, well, God zapped me with that, or God was angry with me, or I must have messed up, so God got after me with that horrible tragedy. None of these things, according to the Bible, are what God is like. God is not this mean-spirited God who's looking to play gotcha with us every second and smash us when we step out of line. And yet, we, even as church people, and even we preacher types, especially, I think, sometimes portray God as if God is this manipulative, vengeful, mean-spirited presence that can really mess us up when he wants to. Hebrews 5 is meant to help correct that. Hebrews 5 is about this description of Jesus as this high priestly kind of figure. Now, we think of high priests or priests kind of removed sometimes these days, but actually the high priest was supposed to be the most empathetic person in the crowd. Still with me? And an empathetic person is literally, empathy means you try to feel the same pain that others, you suffer with someone else. You are feeling their pain in a way that motivates you toward action. The best high priest, the good high priests, and there's always bad ones, but the good ones are the ones who are empathizing with the people they're representing before God. Still with me? They're gentle, they're empathetic, if someone is hurting, they're hurting. If someone is struggling, they're struggling with them. If someone needs the presence of comfort, they seek to be that presence with them. Okay? That's what a high priest is supposed to do. At the best. That's what the high priest is built to do, is called to do, and is supposed to do according to the Bible. So here in Hebrews 5, the writer says, Jesus is the ultimate high priest, demonstrating that God doesn't want to be far away from us when we hurt or when we struggle or even when we sin. No, God wants to be near us. And so he sends his son to be right there in the middle of it with us. Now, I think that's important because if we begin to see God not as just far away going, I hope you get here, good luck. Instead, if we see God as saying, I'm here with you. I'm suffering with you. I'm struggling with you. I'm walking with you. I care about it, and I can even do something about it. Then we begin to reassess the identity of God. Now, so what? Well, here's the so what of that. Do you ever wonder why, if you're familiar with any of the 12-step programs, I was sort of trained in that a little bit in seminary. 12-step programs are those programs that help people out of addiction, right? one of the first things they do in 12-step programs is they talk about the higher power, all that stuff. You've heard that? Like, or if it's a Christian that talks specifically about God. And the first thing that in 12 steps they have to say is, this addiction is too big for me. I can't handle it. Isn't that funny? That's the first thing they have to say. Nothing about conquering that. The first thing they have to admit, step one of these long 12 steps is, this is too big for me to handle on my own. And so I have to just turn it over and recognize that I need help. Well, from God. They're specific. Well, not always specific about what kind of God, but anyway, a higher power than yourself has to help you. Okay, so here's one of the first sort of lecture things they do. And they don't do a lot of lecturing in 12 steps, but here's one of the things they say. They say, look at where your life is, and if you have a God or a higher power, you've probably created that God in such a way that God has gotten you here. So they say something like, so here's what you need to do. Fire that God. And choose the one that's bigger than you. Now, that's unusual language, but for addicts, it really hits them right where they live. Like, yeah, I've all my brilliance, all my versions of God have gotten me here, so I might need to rethink how I've created God in my image instead of letting God create me in His. Still with me? That's why it's important. Hebrews 5 is important. It's showing that this God will go to any length to come and be our high priest, the one who empathizes with us, who shows us gentleness, who walks us through it, who is there to connect with us in our deepest time of sin and need and hurt and despair. When we recognize that this is the God who's trying to get our attention, and we respond to that God through Jesus Christ by the grace that He provides, then our whole life, the way we look at life, the way we look at the sufferings of others, the way we look at the world, much less our own life, right, becomes different. It transforms us literally from the inside out. We begin to look at things differently. We begin to look at the sufferings of ourselves and others differently. Not as God going, you better not step out of line or smash, right? Instead, we look at this God who says, when you step out of line, I am there. I can gently help you. I can pull you back into line. When you're hurting, I'm not trying to hurt you more. I'm trying to walk alongside you so that you might be restored and healed and refreshed. And I'm not talking about some pushover kind of God who's just Mr. Nice Guy. I'm really not talking about that either. One of my Methodist friends says, when I switched, to the Methodist church store. Now, it's from a sister denomination, so it's not like from way across the road there. But, he said, think about he was a long-time Methodist. He is a long-time Methodist. And he said to me, tough thing about Methodists is they think God is too nice. Which makes me laugh. I don't know what he exactly meant. He's like, so it's good to be nice, Charles, but he's like, don't let them fool you. They think God is just Mr. Nice Guy up there. God is actually, kind of more balanced than that. But what I mean is this. God is not just Mr. Nice Guy, but He is full of gentleness, full of peace, full of patience, full of kindness toward us. Jesus came to demonstrate that, to show us that, to live that out. The writer of Hebrews says Jesus walked around at times suffering with those who were suffering, right? Shedding tears, crying. Remember when He stood over Jerusalem, and the Bible says He weeps over Jerusalem. He looks down at this city that God cherishes, but that is straying away from the purposes of God, and He weeps and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to pull you as a hen covers her, her chicks with their wings. I long to pull you in." That's the God who calls us to salvation, to healing, to follow Him. It's that God. So a couple things I think that we learn from this. First of all, we have, from the gentleness of Christ, we learn this. Jesus shows us that God is with us. Among John Wesley's last words to the Methodists before he died, at age 88, by the way, which was a heck of a long time to live back in the 1700s. It's a pretty long time to live now. But, I mean, it's a long time in the 1700s. He's 88. And he said, best of all, he left them with this, best of all, God is with us. I mean, that's the best news I can give you after all these 88 years and telling you, what you're going through and how you're transitioning and how you're sometimes suffering out there for Christ. Best of all, God is with us. So the first thing we learn from the gentleness of Jesus and this God who is calling us is not that he is some God who's saying, here I am, good luck getting to me, I hope you make it. Which is sometimes the way we see God. No, instead we have this God who has come to us, right, through the person of Jesus and says, I'm with you. I am beside you. I am walking with you right now. Even when no one else seems to be paying attention, when no one else seems to be loving you, when no one else seems to care, Jesus says, God is with us. He's right beside us. He zooms into our experiences. What I see in Hebrews 5, 1 through 10 is a God of empathy. Literally a God who's suffering with us so that we might be redeemed, healed. I mean, hey, it's tough to suffer. We all do it in various ways. But it's even worse to sense that you're suffering by yourself. Right? You know what I mean? I mean, man, if I'm suffering, even if you can't fix me, hey, sit with me for a while. Right? Just, you have those friends like that who you can just sort of gripe to, right, a little bit? I mean, nothing too bad about that, as long as you're not gossip about people. But I mean, as long as it's somebody who you can just go, let me just tell you really how I'm doing. Right? God says through Jesus, I'm here for that too. I'm with you for that. And if you don't believe it, look at the Psalms, man. About 2/3 of the Psalms are David just driving about something. I hate to say it. I'm not making fun of it. I'm a big fan of the Psalms, as you know. But really, most of the time, it's David going, God, do you see that going on there? You see how they're acting over there? I can't believe that you're letting them get away with that. That's the Psalms, at least most of them. Right? But they sort of always end this way. David complains for a while, and then something happens in the middle of the complaint. And he sort of snaps out of it. You notice? And by the end of the psalm, he's going, oh, but God, you are faithful. You are good. You are my strength. I couldn't do it without you. You know what I mean? I mean, there's something healing and refreshing about this empathetic God who lets us complain to him. And lets us just... I had a friend who really felt embarrassed because there was a tough time he was going through, and he felt like that he had sort of cursed God. I mean, he was really freaked out about it. He said, Charles, you don't understand. In my anger, I said some horrible things to God and about God, and I just almost dismissed him. I mean, I just yelled at him. And I'm embarrassed. I think he's mad at me. He literally said this to me. Like, God and I are not going well. And I mean, I'm trying to listen and be pastoral and empathetic and nice, and I'm like, what'd you say? And he told me just a little bit of it. I was like, don't tell me any more of it. I get it. You were mad, right? You were hurt. You felt alone. He's like, yeah, Charles, I'm in trouble, man. I really laid it on God. And I go, let me give you some good news. God ain't scared of you. You're like, what? No, God's not intimidated by you at all. You don't scare him. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you can't scare him, you can't offend him. He's big enough to handle it. Did you tell him you're sorry? I said that. I was like, did you tell him you're sorry? Well, yeah. Well, he's all right then. I said, you said some bad things to me. I still love you. He's nicer than me. So, and kind of eased his mind a little bit. We need to remember that through Jesus, we see this high priestly God who is there suffering with us and loving us and walking us through it, who's big enough to take on the burdens that we carry and to become our sacrificial high priest. who is for us. Okay. Final thing is this. Not only is he with us, he's for us. The Bible says he obeyed, he sacrificed for us, he accomplished God's greater purposes for us, that we might have life. He sacrificed himself. Come on, you know what this is about. He gave up something so that we could have something. Now, I know you parents and grandparents out here know what that's all about. And even if you're not that, you know what it's all about. You've either received it or given it at one time in your life, at least. Maybe more than that. I bet you can think of someone in your life who's done that for you. Let me tell you this weird story. This is a small version. This is not even close to the bigger versions of this. It's just a little tiny example, okay, of the bigger picture that I'm illustrating. My first communion I ever presided over as a pastor. Long time ago, 28 years ago, something like that. That's the first communion I ever presided over as a pastor. It was communion time, and I was the pastor, and I was a little freaked out. I mean, it's a big response. You just feel the immensity of that responsibility. Like, wow, this is communion. I've had a bunch of communions, but I've never presided over. It's a big deal, right? You just feel that. And so I'm making sure the ushers are doing their thing, and we're passing out and whatever. It was one of those services where you passed out the stuff. So I'm making sure everybody's passing out. That's a smaller church, it was in Dallas. It was a smaller church. And the woman who helped me, I was new, so she just guesstimated how many would be there. Well, there was curiosity about the new young preacher, and so there was more people there than we planned. And I knew it, and I'm like, oh no, the kitchen is way back over there. We're in trouble. We're going to be close. And I remember standing up there going, Lord, remember that whole loaves and fishes thing? I want to pull that one out if you can, because how embarrassing to not have enough communion for your first communion for these people of God who are here for communion. Oh man, I'll never live this down, and I just started. I'm in trouble. Well, my father and mother came over, and they ended up joining that church actually for a while. My first 5 years in ministry. They came over, made about a 30-minute drive, and came over, my first communion. And my dad picked up one of the things to help usher. He's my dad. So he's over there, and, there's other ushers there I don't know very well. There's my dad. I'm watching my dad. He's got the bread. And I'm thinking, Lord, we're going to run out of bread. And so we're passing things around. His side comes back up, and there's one piece of bread left on it. One little thing. I'm like, going to be close. And my dad quietly steps over toward me from the right and palms the bread and kind of sticks it in my hand and goes back and sits there. My dad did without communion bread that day so that his son wouldn't be embarrassed at his first communion. Who does that? Your dad does that for you. Your mom didn't take care of you. They do stuff like that. They go without so that you're not hurt or embarrassed or uncomfortable. And we had just enough for everybody except my dad. He just sat there like it was the greatest thing in the world. He just pretended. And I think Jesus was okay with that on that day. I think Jesus was cool with that. My dad just sort of faked it. We had enough in the cup, but not the bread. He baked the bread and drank the cup. And I'm sitting there in tears, and everybody thinks it's because I'm so overwhelmed by communion. And there's a sense in which I was, but here's why. I went, well, there you go. Right? And I didn't want to embarrass. My father would have been so embarrassed if I'd have pointed that out. Now it's been so long, he didn't care now, I guess. I'm just telling you. But I don't tell this story very often. Maybe almost never, but I don't know if I've ever told it in public, but it's been 27 years, so I guess it's okay now. But that was my first communion as a pastor. And it set the tone for how I view communion now. I mean, I know the theology behind communion, believe me. I've read communion passages in the Greek. I know communion really well. I know what we believe. I know what sacraments are. Believe me. But really, my best example is not all that theology that I learned, which I'm proud, excited about. It was my dad baking bread so his son wouldn't be embarrassed. It reminded me that we have this God who is for us, not just with us. Still with me? So when that happens, then what? Well, here's what happens. When I begin to fire the version of God that is created in my own image or in the image of something bad, and embrace the real God expressed through the gentleness and love of Jesus Christ, who is for us and with us, here's what happens. It transforms me. I begin to recognize that I'm following this God who is creating me in the image of Christ. Get it? Not in some other image, not in the image of something I've invented, but in the image of Christ, who has come as our empathetic, loving high priest. Then you and I become more like that. I'll end with a preacher story of this, another young minister, not me, who moved into his first pastorate and recognized that there was a mission, like a town mission, that cared for homeless people, not far from the church, and that the church had a 20-year history of helping every month in that mission. So, of course, he's going to show up and do that because it's something the church was really sacrificially had given to over the years. And there was an older gentleman in the congregation who coordinated it. He was the coordinator of their mission outreach. And so the pastor went to him wisely and said, hey, include me in. I want to be there. He said, great. Well, it's custom, he said to the pastor, that our preacher on that night preaches a sermon. We have a worship service. You lead the worship service. Whoever comes, whatever. And then after the service, that gives us time to prepare, the kitchen, the meal. And then after that, you pray, and you dismiss the people, and they come and eat. And that's how we do it. Are you okay with that? Yeah, it's great. I'm ready. So he shows up on Thursday night, mission night, right? He's ready. The preacher, he's got a humdinger of a sermon. He's going to make a good impression. Now the guy you should know who coordinates the thing, who's been there for 20 years, is Joe. And so he checks in with Joe. And Joe says, preacher, I'm so glad you're here. I forgot to tell you that sometimes I've had to fill in over the years because the pastor wouldn't come or didn't take it seriously or couldn't come or whatever. So they're used to me, but I'll introduce you and then I'll go to the back and I'll get to help prepare the food, and you preach and then dismiss. Great, my pleasure. I'll come every month. Right? I'll be here for it. So the worship time happened. The preacher preaches his guts out. Man, he's preaching a great sermon about coming to Jesus and coming to know Jesus and everybody stand. And there's homeless folks. There's all kinds of folks. And this old man kind of wanders in, and he's looking kind of lost, maybe a little disheveled, and maybe a little intoxicated. And so he's preaching and says, if you want to know Jesus, you come right up here and I'll pray with you. And so some guys, come up. And the preacher's excited about that. He's praying with each one. And he gets to this man who's kind of wandering around, disheveled man who just kind of stumbles up there. And of course he gets to him. He says, sir, are you here to meet Jesus? Are you here to meet Jesus? And this guy says, well, I don't know. This is where they have the meals, right? He said, yeah, you're in the right place. So you're in the right place. We're going to have a meal just in a minute. We're here to do some business with God. Are you here to meet Jesus? Are you here to meet Jesus? And the guy says, I'm not sure. I don't know. Well, I've just talked to you about Jesus, and that's who's calling you. I want to pray with you if you want to know Jesus. Are you here to meet Jesus? And the guy says this. He said, maybe I do. Is he anything like Joe? And that young preacher got to say, yeah, he's a lot like Joe. In fact, Joe's a lot like him. This is what happens when we allow the gentleness of God to replace the image of the bullying, mean spirit of God that sometimes gets out there. So I invite you today to come to this Jesus who is the great high priest, the one who suffers for us, the one who stands with us, the one who is for us, because his goal is to love us sacrificially into the kingdom, so that we might be transformed